nuance in tech, pop culture, and what have you since 2017.
The difference I've found between even a 24 megapixel Leica SL with a sensor that we know isn't as good as a Nikon D750 and a GFX are not that big, even if I use the entire sensor of the GFX. If I use great lenses on both, the basic difference I'm getting is resolution and maybe a stop, perhaps, of dynamic range. The benefits of the Fujifilm GFX50s over the Leica SL in the studio come down to this. It's got a flippy screen that tilts down, so if you're not tethered or if you're not Wi-Fi tethered, you can then tilt the camera up and then just move the screen down so that you can see it from most angles. And then you can do it all the way to the right as well. The Leica SL does not do any of that, so you have to rely on tethered via Wi-Fi or other in order to get your very angle views in a difficult or tight studio. One thing that's definitely easier to use about the Leica is its shutter speed dial. When it's up on a camera and you can't really get to any controls because you can't see anything, you just twist that bad boy, you don't have to depress a button, and it goes from the fastest shutter speed that you can possibly get to the slowest. But the GFX's battery in the studio is far better than the Leica SL's. Now the Leica SL has just okay battery for a mirrorless in the studio. I found that there's much worse, like the Fujifilm X-H1, which basically piddles out after 100 images of shooting, chimping, cropping, deleting. And the SL will get anywhere between 200 and 300. Well, the GFX is rated for 400 and I easily get 400 every single time I use it. It's one of the reasons I'm really looking forward to the GFX 100. I expect that that camera gets even better battery life despite the fact that it's packing in a lot more power and functionality. You can change the Leica's battery blind. It doesn't matter if you're in the studio or out in the darkest of winter with gloves on. You just pop this switch here, down, and the battery pops out, but it doesn't fall because it's got a lock. Then you put your finger up like that and it falls out. It only goes in one way. You can't put it in like this, you can't put it in like this, and you can't put it in like this. Like all X cameras, inserting and removing the GFX battery is not easy and it's not reliable. You pop open this lever here and then there's a yellow lock in there, or orange lock. Once you depress that, the battery is free to fall out. But if you have gloves on or it's in the dark, it's actually hard to find any of these controls. Worse than that, the battery goes in this way, the right way. It goes in the wrong way. It doesn't lock, and it goes in backwards. It goes in 4 different ways. It only locks, however, in one direction. But the battery being perfectly square does not give you any indication which way is which. Even Canon and Nikon know that you've got to have one side of the battery humped and the other side square in order to give good tactile feedback to the user which way the battery is up or down. The Leica SL is also a lot easier to insert SD cards into, and that is because it has parallel cards rather than cascaded or staggered slots. The GFX, you can pop one in and then pop another one in, but you have to be careful because you can accidentally pop both out at the same time if your fingers are too big or if you're wearing gloves. With the Leica SL, you depress one here or here. It's impossible, unless you're using 2 fingers like this, to accidentally eject both cards into the snow. The GFX covering its remote control port is not only important when you're in inclement weather, but also when you're in the studio and you don't want to pop open the entire hatch. The Leica SL, everything from remote to USB to all the other functionalities that are included behind the hatch, all have to be accessed at the same time. With the GFX, you pop open just the 2.5 remote control port and that's it. Also, because it's not proprietary, you can plug it into any old remote control for stacking. You pop it in there, just do a 2.5 into the stacking unit and just go have lunch, come back, and 200 images are taken. With the Leica SL, you need some sort of parsing adapter, which isn't cheap and is hard to find, or if you're an electronic whiz, you do it yourself. One thing that infuriates me to no end with the GFX is that when you are in full magnification in order to check your focus, you cannot move up by increments. If you are in full magnification and you nudge the joystick up, it goes up an entire screen. So you're checking the focus of just this lettering that's right here, and you are right in the middle, and you want to check right in the corner, but you're looking at a square space that's like, I don't know, just a couple of millimeters. With the GFX, you pop up the joystick and you're now no longer able to focus here. You're focusing in this next block up. It's just the worst decision. The Leica SL, it moves up almost line by line practically. It's smooth. It's more like controlling a video game character around a screen. Easy peasy and almost impossible to make mistakes with. The GFX is just, I don't know why. It's with all the X cameras, for some reason they still have this magnification problem. They've had it since the beginning. It's not blocked by hardware. This is something that is just their decision and they've stuck with it, and it makes no sense unless, I guess, unless you're into counting screens in order to check magnification or something like that. But apart from that, I see no point in it. It's just a really bad decision, and I wish beyond all hope that Fujifilm will update that with some firmware and not rely on us getting a new camera in order to fix something that's just a horrible programming flaw. With the Leica SL, you go from PASM very easily. You depress the back button and then slide it to whatever you want. Depress it again and you're out. With the GFX, of course, it's like all the X cameras. You got to do your aperture thing, you got to do your shutter speed thing, set to auto, and you got to like think, is that the P, is that the S, is that the A? It's a nightmare. I really love the GFX's e-ink top screen. It's helpful. I can tell all the shutter speeds, all the apertures, I can tell white balance, I can tell everything that I generally need. Unfortunately, it isn't quite as legible as the Leica SLs. But because it's e-ink and doesn't use a lot of power, you can turn the camera off and still see how many shots are in the SD card as well as your battery life. The Leica SLs only does that when the camera is on. Comparing the GFX, which was built for resolution image quality, to the Leica SL, which was built for reliability and speed, is not exactly fair. When having to work in a dark studio or doing extreme macro work, I will take speed over anything else any day of the week, as long as the image qualities are roughly comparable. And I think, as we will see in this comparison, the GFX in 35mm mode isn't better in any way than the Leica SL. Not only does the GFX firmware make it difficult to check the fine focus in extreme magnification due to tiling issues, it also is extremely slow in a dark studio. The SL keeps up speed and a high frame rate even when the studio lights go way down. With the GFX, I found that I have to use either really hot modeling lights all the time or use a pen light in every single high magnification shoot I do. That is because the sensor slows way down. In fact, it gets so bad that I'm probably getting roughly the amount of frames per second that I was getting from a CFV50C. The CFV50C went down to something like 2 or 3 frames per second in a dark studio, and the GFX is just barely better than that. Any slight movement, whether it could be the studio itself because there's a tiny earthquake, it could be a mouse on the floor somewhere a kilometer down the road, anything, the GFX doesn't show smooth transitions from out of focus to in focus because the frames per second are so low. The SL keeps those frames per second high. So even in a dark studio, when the gain is like ratcheting up and the noise is ratcheting up and everything, I can still see what I'm focusing on because it's not just all a blur of complete wavery lines going in and out of focus because of a horrible frames per second count. Rarely do I use the GFX or the Leica SL with native lenses. When I do, I come to this conclusion. The GFX, and in fact all X cameras, have this horrible behavior in any of the automatic exposure modes where the shutter opens up and closes constantly, all the time, unless you're in extreme dark circumstances, in which case the shutter is wide open. Why it does this, I've heard, is because Fujifilm want to make you, the photographer, be able to focus on, I don't know. They say it's for image quality, but how can you, looking through a camera that's always changing its depth of focus because of this opening and shutting aperture, focus on image quality and the people around you where they're like, why is it going? It's the most annoying thing. The Leica SL, on the other hand, does the typical raising and lowering of the voltage inside of the sensor. It gets hotter, it gets colder. So you get more noise in the sensor, you get less noise in the sensor, but you don't get a changing aperture and depth of focus in this weird psychotic image through the EVF or the LCD. I wish that Fujifilm would change this. If you want that and you want to keep the lowest amount of noise through the EVF or the LCD and you want to deal with the chattering, fine. But if you want to turn that off and you want to do it a more traditional and a less intrusive way, that would be great to have that option. The GFX turns any automatic lens that you attach to it, whether adapted or not, into this chattering, loud, annoying mess. SL? Nah, it treats it exactly like a DSLR. It's great. I got the GFX because I felt the limits of modular medium format cameras. They were slower. They required bigger, heavier, and more expensive cameras to work with. The lenses they worked with were pricey out the wazoo. The GFX speeded up all of my processes as well as created a more stable environment from which I can work. Fujifilm, it'd be freaking amazing if you address the tiling issue for fine focus in high magnifications. There's nothing manual about any of the X cameras. They're as automatic as anything else. The only thing that looks manual about them is they have basically crappy facades on top. They've got like a little shutter speed that looks like it's going full stops from stop to finish. You know, you have to disregard the fact that there are third stops on an unlabeled dial, and you have to go to the T mode. You have to disregard that all of the functionalities in the camera are all electronic. Everyone in most countries, everywhere, drive manual cars, and they have since cars started up. It's only like a couple of countries where driving a manual means like you're a man. I can put my car into gear 1 and not stall before going to gear 2. And I can keep it going. It's like, cool. So can my mum. So can her mum. So can my dad. So can the kid down the street who shouldn't even be driving. It's the simplest thing. People in the X circles swear they're not into it for the looks. But if you're like, you know, it'd be better if we had unlabeled shutter speed dials. They're like, no, don't take that away. I'm like, why? Like, because I can tell what shutter speed the camera's on when the camera's off. And you're like, nah, you don't know that because there's an unlabeled dial there. You could have nudged it to 1/3 stop, and it could be, instead of 160, it could be 1/180. It could be 1/125. And they're like, nah, but... And you're like, but what? It all comes down to looks. You can incorporate great looks with functionality. You can meld them, make them work, and then you have something beautiful. But it looks like Fujifilm had finally listened to people who are actually critical of their cameras. Critical in a good way. You can be critical. You say like, you know, if you change this, it'd be easier to use. And they'd be like, you know what, we should stop listening to the circle jerkers. And maybe they did. Because the GFX doesn't have this stupid psychotic shutter speed dial anymore. It's got a couple of unlabeled dials. Now that's going to anger a couple of people, but at least you can go from the slowest shutter speed to the fastest from a single dial. Why, however, they changed the upper screen to show a fake dial instead? I mean, that is just skeuomorphism to the nth degree. At least functionally, it's better than what currently exists on the GFX and the other X cameras. The test I did is to compare the same lens, the same focusing mechanism, the same shutter stop, the same everything. And the only way to do that and not mess one thing or another thing up is to crop the medium format camera into 35mm. So before you're like, that's not fair, Nathan, the Fujifilm's a medium format camera, it must be done in medium or middle format or whatever it is, because it's so much better. Yeah, it does have better image quality when you use the full sensor. I've said that. Had I lenses that were just as sharp, had the same MTF scores and all that, I would do Leica SL in its native format versus the Fujifilm GFX in its native format. Because I don't, but I still wanted to use the same aperture, the same lens, the same focusing system, I had to crop the Fujifilm down to 35mm. In order to keep things equivalent, I put both cameras on the same Novoflex BALPRO, I used the same 105mm Sinaron digital lens, and I put both cameras on some sort of EF to native mount adapter. If I were doing a commercial project like this, I would light it slightly differently because there's a couple of lines here that show up that shouldn't be in a final image. Lined up 1-to-1, the GFX and SL show similar detail in the highlights, similar detail in the shadows, and similar sharpness throughout. I see no real differences. Now you may, and if you do, be sure to leave a comment and say what it is that I've missed. Or if you didn't like the video, do the Gerald Undone thing and hit the thumbs down twice. That's a good one. I like that. It's really good. That guy's clever. This week I'm busy cleaning up after a shoot, so I probably won't have time to do a Thursday thing or a Friday in forums, in which case I'll see you next week.